Imagine it's 3 in the morning. Your partner wakes you up, but not because they had a nightmare. They're confused. They're slurring their words. They can barely sit up. Their skin is pale, clammy. You touch their forehead and it's burning up, but they're shivering uncontrollably. In most households, you might think, okay, this is a bad flu. Let's get some water, maybe some ibuprofen, and go back to sleep. But for the people we're talking to today, that decision could be fatal. For them, this isn't a flu. It's a physiological collapse. And you, the person standing next to the bed in your pajamas, you are the only thing standing between them and the unthinkable. Today, we are looking at a medical condition that is invisible to the outside world, but all-consuming for the people inside it. We're talking about adrenal insufficiency, or AI. But we aren't just talking about the patient. We're doing a deep dive into the person standing beside them, the caregiver. Based on a powerful guide from My Adrenal Life titled The Unsung Heroes, we're going to explore what it means to be the lifeline for someone whose body has forgotten how to survive stress.
It really is a lifeline, Jake. That's not hyperbole. When we talk about adrenal insufficiency, we're talking about a broken engine. The guide you mentioned calls caregivers unsung heroes, and honestly, that's the perfect framing because the labor is almost entirely invisible until it becomes an emergency.
Let's start with that engine analogy. I think most people have heard of adrenaline, and they've probably heard of cortisol, usually in the context of stress is bad. You see wellness influencers constantly trying to lower their cortisol. But for these patients, low cortisol is the enemy. What is actually breaking down here?
Right. We demonize cortisol so much in modern culture, but biologically, it is essential for life. It's not just a stress hormone that makes you anxious. It's the fuel injector for your body. The National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases defines AI as a disorder where the adrenal glands simply don't make enough of certain hormones, specifically cortisol.
So what does the fuel injector do in this scenario?
Think of your body like a car. When you're idling in the driveway, you need a little bit of gas just to keep the engine turning. That's your baseline cortisol. It maintains your blood pressure, regulates your sugar, and keeps inflammation down. Now imagine you pull onto the highway and try to merge at 60 miles an hour. You stomp on the gas pedal. In a healthy body, the adrenal glands dump a massive amount of cortisol into the system to handle that demand. But in someone with AI, they stomp on the pedal and nothing happens.
The engine stalls.
Exactly. And in a human body, an engine stall looks like a crash in blood pressure, severe vomiting, consciousness slipping away. It's vascular collapse. That's the battlefield the caregiver is living on. They have to manually manage the gas pedal because the automatic system is broken.
And the My Adrenal Life text breaks this down into types, right? It's not all the same cause.
Correct. It's important to distinguish them. Primary AI, often called Addison's disease, is where the adrenal glands themselves are damaged, usually by an autoimmune attack. Think of it as the factory being destroyed. Then you have secondary AI. This is where the pituitary gland in the brain stops sending the signal, the ACTH hormone, to the adrenals. The factory is fine, but the foreman is asleep and never orders any production. There's also tertiary AI, which often comes from long-term steroid use, where the body just stops making its own cortisol because it's been getting it artificially for so long.
Regardless of the type, the result for the caregiver is the same. The patient is fragile.
Fragile and high maintenance in the most literal medical sense. The guide emphasizes that for the caregiver, the why matters less than the what now. Whether it's primary or secondary, a stomach bug is no longer just a stomach bug. It's a potential death sentence.
It's interesting you mentioned Addison's disease. I feel like that's a term people might have heard in history class but don't really understand. It has a pretty heavy legacy.
It does. It was named after Dr. Thomas Addison, a British physician who first described it in 1855. At the time, he called it a state of anemia coupled with a wasting of the body. And we have to be stark about this. Before the synthesis of cortisone in the late 1940s and 50s, a diagnosis of Addison's was fatal. There was no treatment. You essentially wasted away.
So living with this is actually a relatively modern miracle.
It is, and the most famous example of this cultural legacy is actually John F. Kennedy.
We know now, based on medical records reviewed by historians like Robert Dallek, that JFK had Addison's disease. He collapsed in London in 1947 and was actually given his last rites. He was traveling with a supply of corticosteroids that were incredibly rare at the time. But during his presidency, the White House actively hid it. They called it adrenal insufficiency due to malaria to avoid the stigma of a chronic wasting disease. They didn't want the public to know the president relied on daily medication just to survive.
That secrecy feels like it still lingers. The My Adrenal Life guide talks about the invisible burden. Your partner looks fine at a dinner party, but an hour later, they might be on the floor. How does a caregiver spot the trouble before the collapse?
That is the core skill set, becoming a detective of the invisible. The guide lists textbook symptoms like fatigue or salt cravings, which makes sense for Addison's because you're losing sodium. But the caregiver needs to look for the non-typical signs. These are the subtle cues. The text mentions temperature dysregulation. If your partner is freezing cold in a warm room, that's a red flag. Or brain fog, but not just, I forgot my keys. We're talking about confusion, an inability to finish a sentence.
One thing that stood out to me in the text was the mention of mood changes. It says specifically, this is a physiological, not psychological response. That feels like a crucial distinction for a partner.
It's massive. Low cortisol affects the brain's emotional regulation centers. A patient might become suddenly irritable, snappy, or just emotionally flat. If you're a partner, your instinct might be, why are you being a jerk? But the veteran caregiver knows, wait, you're not angry, you're low. The guide calls this the crash. It's a rapid decline in energy that feels flu-like. Recognizing that irritability is a chemical failure, not a relationship issue, can save the marriage and the patient's life.
It reminds me of the spoon theory by Christine Miserandino. It's used for a lot of chronic illnesses like lupus, but it feels very applicable here. You have a limited number of spoons, units of energy per day, but for an AI patient, if they run out of spoons, they don't just get tired, their system shut down.
That's a great parallel. And for the caregiver, you are the one counting the spoons. You are the one noticing, okay, we went to the grocery store and had a stressful phone call. You're done. We need to rest. You become the external battery monitor.
Let's get technical about the management. The text dedicates a whole section to sick day rules and stress dosing. To the uninitiated, stress dosing sounds like something you do after a bad day at work, like, I need a stress dose of chocolate. But in this context, it's medical math.
It is survival math. Remember the fuel injector analogy? Stress dosing is manually stomping on the gas pedal. If the body is under stress, and biologically stress means fever, infection, a broken bone, or even severe emotional trauma, the body needs more cortisol. The sick day rules generally dictate doubling or tripling the oral hydrocortisone dose. The guide specifically mentions the 3x3 rule, often used. Triple the dose for 3 days. It's not optional. If you have a fever over 100.5, you must increase the steroid. If you don't, the fever burns through the cortisol, the blood pressure drops, and you enter crisis.
The guide makes a really interesting point about wounds. It says even a deep cut or dental work requires stress dosing. Why? It's just a cut.
Because cortisol is vital for inflammation control and wound healing. A physical trauma is a high-demand event for the body. If you don't provide the extra cortisol, the body can't manage the inflammation, and the systemic stress rises until, again, you crash. The caregiver has to be the one to say, you just cut your hand slicing a bagel, go take 10 milligrams right now.
Okay, so let's talk about the worst case scenario, the adrenal crisis. The text calls it a when, not if. That's terrifying.
It is the reality of the condition. An adrenal crisis is a medical emergency comparable to heart attack or diabetic coma. The blood pressure bottoms out, severe vomiting causes dehydration, which lowers BP even further, and the patient can lose consciousness. This is where the caregiver shifts from partner to paramedic. The guide is very clear. Do not hesitate. You have to administer the emergency injection.
This is the Salu-Cortef injection?
Usually, yes. It's a high-dose liquid corticosteroid, often 100 milligrams. It's an intramuscular injection, usually into the thigh. It's scary to jab a needle into someone you love, but the guide emphasizes if they are vomiting and can't keep pills down, or if they are lethargic, you inject. You buy them the time to get to the hospital.
And then you call 911. But here's where the guide gets into the advocacy part, and I found this fascinating and frustrating. You get to the ER, you tell them your partner is in crisis, and they might not know what to do?
This is the nuanced perspective of the disease that is so difficult. Adrenal insufficiency is rare. A typical ER doctor sees heart attacks and strokes all day. They might see one Addisonian crisis in a year or 5 years. They see a vomiting patient and think stomach flu or dehydration. They might want to just give fluids and wait.
But waiting is deadly.
Exactly. Waiting is deadly. The guide tells caregivers to be the second set of ears and the loud voice in the room. You have to say, my partner has adrenal insufficiency. They need IV hydrocortisone immediately. The text offers a brilliant tactic for when the medical team isn't listening.
The write it in the chart move?
Yes. If a doctor refuses to give the steroid because they want to wait for lab results, which takes too long, you say, please note in the patient's chart that I requested emergency steroids for adrenal crisis and you are declining to treat. That usually changes the energy in the room very quickly. It signals that you know the standard of care and you are creating a paper trail of their negligence.
That is such a powerful tool. It stops the doctor knows best dynamic in its tracks, but it puts a huge burden on the caregiver. You have to be aggressive when you're already terrified.
It does, and that leads to the emotional toll the guide discusses, caregiver burnout. You are living with a low-grade anxiety of what if constantly. Every time the phone rings, every time they look a little pale, the guide emphasizes validating the grief, not just for the patient who has lost their healthy self, but for the caregiver who has lost the carefree nature of their relationship. You can't just go on a spontaneous hiking trip without checking the med kit, the injection expiration dates, the nearest hospital.
And the text urges caregivers to find their own support. It lists resources like the NADF, the National Adrenal Diseases Foundation. Why is community so important here?
Because isolation is dangerous. When you're the only one in your friend group who knows what a Solu-Cortef vial looks like, you feel alienated. Organizations like the NADF or the CARES Foundation connect you with people who speak the same language. They know what it's like to sit in an ER waiting room at 4 a.m. praying the saline drip works. That validation is its own kind of medicine.
It's really striking. We often think of medicine as the pills and the surgeries, but in chronic conditions like AI, medicine is also the vigilance of the person sleeping next to you. It's the observation, the advocacy, the stress dosing math.
Absolutely. The patient is fighting the war inside their body, but the caregiver is managing the logistics of the battlefield. The guide ends by calling them a lifeline, and that is biologically accurate. Without that external brain ensuring the cortisol gets into the system fails.
To anyone listening who is in this role, you are doing the work of a pancreas, essentially. You are an external organ for someone you love. It is heavy, it is scary, but as My Adrenal Life puts it, it is heroic.
And if you know a caregiver like this, maybe don't ask them how the patient is doing. Ask them how they are doing. They're likely carrying a weight they never put down.
A crucial reminder. If this episode opened your eyes to the invisible labor of medical caregiving, send it to someone who needs to hear it.